This is Pastor Lutzer, and today my topic is grief and loneliness. Full disclosure, my wife is still living. All of our children are living, though we did have a stillborn grandchild a number of years ago. My grandchildren are still living, and so I have not experienced the same kind of grief that many of you have experienced and are experiencing. So you might ask the question, what qualifies you to talk about grief and loneliness? Well, as a pastor throughout the years, I've often observed bad grief and good grief. And I think that some of the things that I share are going to be very helpful to you. But then something else, I'm going to share with you a story of a man whose wife died 9 months ago. And I think that you will find his comments and what he has to say very fascinating. And then we're going to relate it to the scriptures, and I believe that you are going to be given hope as a result of this time together. This is primarily directed to those of you who are grieving, not necessarily to those of you who are grieving because you've been told you have a terminal disease. That would be for another time and another subject. I remember back in the 1970s reading Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's book entitled Death and Dying, and some of you might remember that she has 5 stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then acceptance. And of course, that has to do with those of you who may have a terminal disease. And I want to just encourage you by a word before we get to the actual topic of those of you who are grieving because of the loss of a loved one. I came across this. There are really 3 big C's that we must face. Well, there's cancer, there's corona, but think of what they cannot do. They are so limited that they cannot cripple love, they cannot shelter or shatter hope, they cannot corrode faith, they cannot eat away at our peace, they cannot destroy our confidence, they cannot kill friendships, they cannot shut out memories, they cannot silence courage, they cannot reduce eternal life, they cannot quench the spirit, they cannot lessen the power of the resurrection. I have frequently told sick people that there is no problem that you have that a good resurrection won't solve. Well, those are 2 of the C's, but the 3rd C, as you might have already guessed, is Christ. For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. Well, now I want to begin by talking about grief specifically, and I'm going to discuss what I call bad grief. And as I think about this, it falls into various categories, and I'll list those categories and perhaps give you an illustration or 2 of each. First of all, bad grief is driven by false guilt. I'm thinking, for example, of a woman whom my parents knew. I have vague recollections of her. She convinced her husband to go to a concert one evening that he did not want to go to. En route, they were in a car accident and he was killed. She went to his grave for 14 years every morning to moan her loss and to deal with the grief and the sense of guilt that she felt because she convinced him to go somewhere where he didn't want to go. My friend, today, that is false guilt. That is not guilt driven by God. All of us have said to our mates, let's do something, and it could end in tragedy. People need to get beyond that. That's false guilt. Let me give you another example that is even more poignant, really. A little girl says, "Mommy, can I cross the street?" And the mother thoughtlessly says yes, thinking they would do it together. The little girl runs out into the middle of the street and is hit by a car and killed. I don't ever expect that mother to forget that incident. She will die with that memory. But at the same time, there comes a point where she has to get over that. Her intentions were good. All of us have made statements that could be misinterpreted. And she needs to recognize that she is not responsible. As time goes by, she must move beyond that. The guilt that she feels is not guilt given by God. So I've seen grief that I think is bad grief because of the fact that there is false guilt. Let me give you another kind. It is driven by human worship. Now that's a strong word. I actually changed it later to an unhealthy reverence. Here's a woman whose husband was a professor and he had many books, and so she roped off his study. Nobody could go in it. You couldn't take a book out of it. Everything had to stay just the way it was when he died. To disturb it would be a sign of irreverence. I don't agree with that at all. You know, it's interesting. The other day, Rebecca said to me, "What should I do with all of your sermon notes if you were to die?" You have to understand that I've been preaching for 40 years and I have these sermon notes in boxes. I said, "Rebecca, tell my children that if they want to keep a few for their files, these are notes that their father used when he preached from the pulpit of Moody Church, but feel free to get rid of them, burn them. And as far as my library is concerned, do whatever you want with the books, give them away. I don't want her to have an unhealthy reverence for my memory." You know, the Bible talks about the fact that we are like grass that comes, one generation comes and the other goes, and so we fade away and a new generation comes, and we just have to recognize that and help people to not be so attached to their loved ones that they need to keep what I consider to be human worship almost. Let me tell you the story of a man by the name of John. His wife died 15 or 20 years ago, and the dishes in the stove are still the dishes that were there when she died. Rebecca and I were in his office one time, and I think we counted correctly 14 different pages. I should say 14 different pictures of his late wife. Let's not have such attachments that we can't move beyond these incidents and this grief. I think it's an unhealthy reverence for the person who has died. Let me quickly go on to another, and that is excessive self-pity. Let me introduce you to a woman by the name of Doris. She parks her Buick in the church parking lot and then goes into church, wipes her tears, sings her songs, goes home, cries all the way, and keeps saying to God over and over again, "Your grace is not sufficient." You know, God dealt with her in a prayer room with a number of women. She recognized that she, of course, loved her husband very much, which is wonderful, but at the same time, she was so filled with self-pity, she couldn't move beyond it. There are things that we need to move beyond. Let me give you one other example, and it is the most gut-wrenching, if I might put it that way. It has to do with a lack of trust in God and His sovereignty. Perhaps you've heard me tell the story of a man maybe 40 years ago. I was speaking in another state here in the Midwest. He came to me later, and I can still see him under that tree. He made such an impression on me. I've not forgotten it. He had a 15-year-old boy. If I remember correctly, the boy committed suicide. At least the boy was dead. And he told me, if I get to heaven and find out that my son isn't there, I'm going to ask God to send me to hell so that I can be with him. I understand his agony. Let's not be quick to judge him. But you know something? That is really wrong. First of all, in hell, I mean, this is terrifying. We don't even know if people are going to be together. But more than that, the Bible assures us that God will wipe away every tear from our eyes. I don't think God is going to come along with a handkerchief and then wipe our tears away. I think God is going to give us His perspective, and in such a way that we'll be comfortable and rejoice in His justice, in His righteousness, and we will praise Him forever and be content with what He has done. So take courage. There are times when all that we can do is to trust God, especially with unknown questions, or I should say questions that have no answers. I think those are examples of what I call bad grief. Now let's talk about good grief. What is good grief? Well, good grief recognizes that grief is a transition. Remember, in the Old Testament, they would grieve for 40 days and then they'd have to move on. I'm not suggesting for a moment that in 40 days your grief is over, but there was a period of time of transition. I understand that in the early days in America, what frequently happened is people had armbands to show that they were grieving, and they'd have those on for a number of weeks or months. It was a sign that I'm in transition and I'm going to move on. Now, that moving on oftentimes is very difficult because our emotions fluctuate, don't they? One moment, I'm told by those who have experienced a great deal of grief, you say to yourself, I think things are getting better. I can actually manage now. And the next day, the grief comes back, perhaps more powerfully than ever. And we should expect that. That's the nature of grief. I was born on a farm, and we used to have what was known as a runaway. A runaway was when some horses were spirited, and they'd run off, and they would not respond to the reins. And whenever a farmer had a runaway, we'd generally hear about it, town gossip, and we knew what that meant. The horses would have to run until they were totally exhausted, and then finally they were ready to trudge back home rather slowly. That's the way our emotions are. Sometimes they are simply uncontrollable, but eventually we become exhausted and we end up back home. That kind of grief is normal grief, and I would put it into the category of good grief. Someone says rain falls because the clouds can no longer handle the weight. Tears fall because the heart can no longer handle the pain. I'd say also that good grief is a grief that has hope. One day, a woman here at the Moody Church came to see me because her husband had died unexpectedly. They were deeply in love, and she was contemplating suicide because she said, I can't live without him and I want to be with him. That's what she told me. Now, this is what I told her. I said, I want to make a promise to you. You have one responsibility and only one responsibility, and that is to get up in the morning, put one foot ahead of the other, go through your day, and she had a job, so she had to go to work, go through your day, and then the next day do the very same thing over and over again. And then I think I told her in a year things would be different. I'm not sure exactly if I gave a period of time, but I gave her hope. And then I said these words. I said, if you do that, I promise you that someday the sun will shine again. I lost track of her, but she came back to the Moody Church, saw her a couple of years later, asked how she was doing, and she remembered what I had said, and she said, Pastor, the sun is shining. We as believers have to recognize that we give one another hope because we sorrow not as those who have no hope. Hang in there, and someday the sun is going to shine again. Let me say that good grief also gives us the opportunity to ponder our future. It is indeed a time of transition. Let me give you some quotes. Grief never ends, but it changes. It's a passage, not a place to stay. It's not a sign of weakness or lack of faith. It is the price of love. That really is true. Remember the shortest verse in the Bible? I remember in Sunday school when I was a boy, we used to say, I know a verse in the Bible. Well, the shortest verse in the Bible is John chapter 11, verse 35. Jesus wept. But isn't it interesting? The chapter opens by saying, now Jesus loved Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. Lazarus dies. Jesus even knows what he intends to do, namely to raise him from the dead, and yet Jesus wept. It's the price of love. If you love, you will weep. C.S. Lewis said these words, getting over a painful experience is much like crossing monkey bars. You have to let go at some point in order to move forward. So good grief is grief that sees grief as a comma and not a period. Now what I'd like to do is to leave with you and share with you my friend Paul. Paul's wife died 9 or 10 months ago, and he's been emailing me, and he's given me permission to share with you some of his emails. It's the story of grief, and you're going to be greatly helped by the way in which he defines it, how he describes it. And then we're going to go to the Bible, and we're going to really find that there is hope. Now, Paul's wife died. His wife's name was Kathy. He said it was about 20 months ago that her doctor took me aside and informed me that we should make the most of the upcoming year as she wouldn't make it to Christmas, and to treasure each moment knowing that every special thing we did would be the last time. And instead of allowing sadness to overrule, I should count it a blessing, because many people don't get the opportunity of sharing life together before life comes to the end. So we took his advice. Shortly after, in early January, by the way, she did make it to Christmas. This would have been Christmas of 2019. But shortly after, in January, her body began to fail. She passed away at home on March 14th, 2020. Just as she took her last breath, the large digital clock on her nightstand flipped to 8:28. As I was holding Kathy and felt her soul depart, my daughter Stephanie said, "Dad, look at the clock. It's reading 8:28, Romans 8:28. It's going to be all right. God is with us. Mom is safely home with the Lord. No more cancer, no more MS." He continues, he says, "Grief is not my friend, but it's also not my enemy anymore. At first it was. When it paid a visit, I knew exactly where it would strike and what to expect. But I no longer run from it, and I've begun to make my peace with it. Instead of running away from it, I've learned to seize the intensities of each visit as an opportunity to intensely thank God for the wonderful gift of Kathy that he has given to me." While Kathy and I spent a year together doing last times, I hadn't considered that I would spend this next year doing first times. These are the same things that we used to do together, but now I do them alone. There are many of them because we've spent our entire life having lived where we were born. I shared with my children how difficult it is every day, and right now even, as I'm constantly having to decide what to do with Mom's personal things, simple things like taking down the Christmas tree. I'm feeling a little foolish too, as I brought some of the grief on myself. I made some memorial ornaments for my children that had a picture of Kathy on them, and I hung them on my own tree so that her memory could be present with us as we let the grandkids open their gifts. I didn't think about the fact that I would have to take the tree down, and then I'd have to decide again what to do with another ornament that had to do with her. He continues and says, "Her voice is still on the phone recorder. My children don't want me to remove it, so I don't, but it's hard for me to check messages and listen to her greeting." Now listen carefully. "But I think the School of Sorrow has 3 rooms, not 2. The first 2 are grief and loneliness, and they are very easy to find, but the third is a well-concealed bunker. I've only recently discovered the third one. I never knew that it was there. Grief and then loneliness, and then I found a lower room, the bunker. Yes, there's a trap door in the room of loneliness. It was underneath the floorboards. Below the room where loneliness dwells was a hidden room that was stocked full of supplies, enough supplies for someone to hide for a very long time. The first 2 rooms, grief and loneliness, eventually they become tolerable because I know what to expect, but the bunker is the most fearful. It feels too safe. It's a great hiding place, and it's like a safe room. Now, I have to tell you that Paul is a builder, and so he has actually designed, he says, some bunkers, some real bunkers. He says these are well stocked with supplies, and access into them is bolted from the inside. In a similar way, I've been dealing with like I've been hanging out in a spiritual bunker for the last few months. It's the place I go to hide so that I will not be a burden on others. The bunker is hiding in plain sight when I go to church. Some of the real bunkers that I've made are masterfully hidden. Some are built directly underneath gardens and large buildings. The average person could be cultivating a garden and would not even know that there was a bunker underneath. Just so, in church I can sing and pray and fellowship with others. I can smile and joke and hang out and even go out to dinner with friends afterwards, and it feels good. I know that I have successfully concealed my grief, but no one knows the grief that is still in my heart. I don't even know if these feelings are a normal part, but if someone asked to give me the name of my hidden bunker, I'd refer to it as the room where you are on your own hidden because you don't want to be with others who mean well but don't understand what you are going through. Some have tried to encourage me by reminding me that for the believer there is no sting in death, but I usually take that as code for Paul, get over it, move on. Well, I do intend to move on. I've been restructuring our business, finances, and wills, but I struggle with why I would ever want to get over it. The fact that I had a best friend ever. All that to say, I often hide how I'm really feeling, especially in church. I do such a good job that nobody asks. I'm careful because I don't want to be a source of discomfort to others or drag anyone down. It feels better when I'm worshiping along with other people, but while I agree with my friends about how death has no sting, I feel it still has a mean left hook. I recently came to reckon with the fact that this journey will be very long, and I'm on my own. I tend to want to go back to my bunker when my closest Christian friends imply things like, "Hey, Paul, this is your finest hour. Be an example of faith. Don't let us down. Don't let God down." Recently, I received an email from a leader in my church admonishing me that I seem to be self-absorbed and I'm never going to get over Kathy if I keep dwelling on her. He said, "Paul, she's in heaven." That made me realize that people around me are sensing the kind of fatigue that comes when people who are grieving don't ever get over it as fast as they want them to. That makes me withdraw. I wondered, how does a broken leg run? How does a broken wing fly? How can a broken heart beat strong? How does a boat sail without wind? Oh, well, he's a trusted friend for sure, and I know that his comments are well-intentioned, like some kind of tough love intending to wake me up. That's just the way he is. Maybe he's right, too. But it offers little comfort. Ironically, he prefaced his comments by telling me how much he loved me. I always fear when friends start out with, "You know how much I love you," because I know that what they are going to say is going to make me feel as if I'm not loved. And then he quoted the Psalms where God is close to the brokenhearted. I thought to myself, well, he must really be close to me. I guess he reported back that he had a great counseling session with me, and I'm okay with that. But I retreat into my bunker. I often wonder how many grieving Christians can relate to what I'm saying. I don't think I'll ever know because I never ask anyone. But I also wonder if someone else is hiding in their bunker, hiding their grief from me, and that makes me care. Well, I was listening to Johnny Erickson Tada, and by the way, if you're not acquainted with her ministry, that's a great ministry. It's entitled Johnny and Friends. I encourage you to go to her website. But he says, I was listening to Johnny Erickson Tada the other day and was surprised to hear that she was talking about this phenomenon dwelling within the church. And as she was sharing about how inadequately equipped people are to be there and walk beside others who are experiencing tragic losses, the interviewer asked her what she thought the church should do, and she replied, learn. I liked that. It made me feel like maybe I wasn't in my bunker alone after all. It also made me want to learn in my own schoolhouse so that I can help others who hurt in indescribable ways to climb out of the bunker, just like me. I want to say a word now as a pastor to those of you who have experienced grief and loneliness. Don't make quick decisions, especially remarriage. Be very cautious. I know many instances where remarriage has brought about a great deal of happiness. In fact, maybe they were better marriages the second time than the first. And don't feel guilty if you rejoice in that. But at the same time, I can tell you many stories of men particularly who married too quickly because they could not take the loneliness, and it ended badly. Someone who did remarry and has a happy marriage said this, and I'll never forget it. He said, when you remarry, it's not just stanza 2 of a hymn. You know, you've had stanza 1 and now you sing stanza 2. He said, it's an entirely different song. Well, I'd change that a little bit and say that I know some instances where it wasn't just entirely a different song, but an entirely different hymnal. Be very careful. Marry in haste, repent in leisure. Take your time, be wise, get wisdom, and be careful. You may do the wrong thing. Lonely people sometimes make bad decisions. Now, I want to share with you that you do have hope because you have 2 resources. The first resource is God. And I encourage you today, as someone who is struggling with loneliness, if this is where you are at, unleash all of your struggles and your anger, your unanswered questions. Unleash it on God, if I might put it that way. I remember a woman, I told her, be honest with God. And she said, oh, I can't tell God how I feel. I don't want him to know. I had to laugh. I mean, are you telling me that God doesn't know how you feel? Tell him how you feel. Look at this. Asaph. When I meditate on God, I moan. When I meditate, my spirit faints. You hold my eyelids open. I am so troubled I cannot speak. I consider the days of old, the years of long ago. I said, let me remember my song in the night. Let me meditate on my heart. Then my spirit made a diligent search. But will the Lord spurn forever and never again be faithful? Has his steadfast love forever ceased? Are his promises at an end for all time? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has he in anger shut up his compassion? Do it reverently. Tell God exactly how you feel. By the way, that's Psalm 77, and it ends by a note of praise because the psalmist goes on to say that he remembered what God did for Israel, and he believes in the faithfulness of God, and he's going to move beyond the present and accept God's comfort. But I do want to tell you that there is one psalm, and only one, that ends without any hope and without any comfort. I want to read you the last verses. And thanks to my good friend Paul, I'm going to refer to this as the bunker psalm. This is how it ends. But I, O Lord, cry to you. In the morning my prayer goes up before you. O Lord, why do you cast out my soul? And why do you cast my soul away? Why do you hide your face from me, afflicted and close to death from my youth up? I suffer your terrors, I am helpless. Your wrath has swept over me. Your dreadful assaults destroy me. They surround me like a flood all day long. They close in on me together. You have caused my beloved and my friend to shun me. My companions have become darkness. End of Psalm. It's a man in the bunker. His friends have become darkness, and he feels under the wrath of God, and like my friend Paul, all alone. Why does the psalm end this way? Well, many commentators, and I've read them, they say, well, this is really a strange psalm. It doesn't end with any hope in God, but there is faith throughout it. Yeah, there is some faith, I grant that, but the author, another son of Korah, stays in the bunker. It's very interesting that there is one commentator who said this. He said, as you read these last few verses, you recognize that what you are reading is really what Jesus experienced. The terror of God, the wrath of God is referred to, the rejection of friends. All of his disciples forsook him and fled at the cross. Of course, John did come back, but he felt alone. And then Jesus experienced darkness, great darkness that could be felt, the kind of darkness that was experienced in Egypt during the time of the plagues. And Jesus experienced all of this and the darkness so that you and I might come out of that bunker and we might be able to walk in light. We don't have to stay there forever. By the way, well might the sun in darkness hide and shut its glories in when Christ, the great Redeemer, died for man, the creature's sin. To those of you in the bunker, I want you to know that Jesus has been there. And he says, I endure the darkness that you might walk in light. There is hope on the other side. The acceptance and the glory of God. And will you remember this, that feelings are not facts. You may feel as if God has forsaken you. You may feel as if you're committed to the bunker and you must stay there, but those are lies. Jesus died so that we can have his light. The sun can shine again, as I mentioned to that woman that I referred to earlier. So there's one resource. Oh, by the way, just in case you're wondering, that psalm is Psalm 88. And Paul, thanks to you, I'm going to think of it as the psalm of the bunker. But there's another resource, and that is other people. Where do you find people who do understand? People who won't judge you, people who appreciate the fact that grief is very lonely and very difficult. Well, it's other people who are in the bunker. That's why I am so excited about the fact that there are many ministries out there helping people, primarily grief share ministries. By the way, there is actually a ministry called Grief Share, great ministry, but there's also another one entitled Grief Care Fellowship. I hope that your local church has a ministry to those who grieve, and there are resources there. Let me mention again Grief Care Fellowship, and I mention that because the folks who started it are actually friends of mine. There was a widower, they married happily, but they understand grief and they have many resources. Let me mention it again, Grief Care Ministries. Check it out. Receive help. There are people out there who understand you, who'll stand with you. I walked a mile with sorrow. I walked a mile with pleasure. She chatted all the way, but left me none the wiser for all she had to say. I walked a mile with sorrow, and ne'er a word said she. But oh, the things I learned when sorrow walked with me. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus didn't ask his 3 disciples, the ones to whom he was the closest, he didn't ask them to pray with him, though he may have mentioned that. But why did he say, "Be with me"? You see, he could have said, "Well, you can just stay 200 yards away and pray for me." He wanted to be with them in his moment of sorrow. I hope that there are people who are walking with you in your moment of sorrow, and remember this, that the suffering of this present world cannot be compared to the glory that shall be revealed in us. It will be worth it all when we see Jesus, and the promise is that your sorrow shall be turned into joy. Grieve well, because it will end when we see Jesus. God bless you.